I've been drawn to coming-of-age stories since I started coming of age. As a kid, they offered varied looks at the struggles I found myself going through, namely the awkwardness and unsureness that comes from stepping out of the warm comforts of childhood and into the unknown. I saw my life and the lives of my friends reflected in these kinds of stories, giving me a greater understanding that the decisions we made would influence the types of people we might become, and pressuring me to decide if I should lean into that or run as far away from some potential future as possible. Growing up is beautiful and tragic, and it leaves a mark on everyone who experiences it, which is why I think these stories are relevant to people even well after they have come of age. We all share in the joys and dissatisfactions that come from shedding your layer of innocence and becoming a more permanent version of yourself. A version of yourself that is different from who everyone else thought you would become, from who you thought you would become. A version that, for this reason, is in some way a disappointment. And now that I've gotten a little dark here, you're probably wondering, when is he going to talk about a goddamn video game? The answer is now. With improvements in technology and increased standards in what players look for in a narrative, coming-of-age stories have become more and more prominent in the video game scene. The different tools at game developers' disposal allow them to bring these stories to life in ways that books and films really can't. From giving players choices that influence the story to simply controlling the movements of a character, games have the ability to blur the line between a player and protagonist, allowing them to simulate the tumultuous experience of growing up in a way that its counterparts can't really replicate. There have been loads of great titles, especially indie ones, that center on these journeys of self-discovery and growing up, but I want to focus on one game in particular that has stuck with me because of how powerfully it deals with the fear of becoming someone no one wants you to be. 2018's God of War. At the heart of God of War are two intertwined character arcs, a tale of redemption for Kratos and a coming-of-age story for Atreus. This kind of setup has gotten a lot of play recently, and I think it's because of how well these two narrative threads link together. On one hand, there's the character with a bright and open future, taking those first steps into growing up, and on the other, there's a character with a dark past, who has the nearly impossible task of leaving the pain and the guilt from it behind. From the onset, it's clear that the last thing Kratos wants is for Atreus to become like him, to be fueled purely by revenge and destructive rage. Atreus is an extremely likable character. He's clever, kind, funny, and genuinely helpful from a gameplay perspective, all of which led me to want the best for him, sharing in the same fears Kratos has about his future. I found myself feeling protective over the boy. When playing, I wanted to keep his sense of wonder intact, the same wonder he showed when seeing the marvels of Midgard. I appreciated the kindness he displayed to every stranger we came across, and I hoped he would never lose that. So when Atreus finds out he's a god and starts acting flippantly about the world around him and maliciously to those who considered him a friend, I was disappointed in him, and I started to worry where it might lead. And when he eventually did learn the error of his ways and repented for what he did, I felt a sense of relief being able to believe in his pureness again. By the way, this is where I spoil the entire game. To me, what makes God of War such a powerful, true-to-life, coming-of-age story is that at the end, after a climactic scene where Kratos assures Atreus and the player that the boy will turn out okay,
"Who I was is not who you be. We must be better."
a single line calls all of that into question, playing on the fears that Kratos and the player both hold about Atreus' future.
I guess there's just one thing I don't understand. My name on the wall. The giants called me Loki?
Loki.
This reveal comes with a lot of baggage because anyone even mildly familiar with any of Loki's representations know that he is an asshole. For a lot of people, especially those from places outside of Europe where Norse mythology is less likely to be taught in school, their perception of Loki probably comes from Marvel. Me being in that camp, the reveal worried me because it went directly against what I wanted for Atreus' future. Loki is an incredibly interesting and deep character in the Marvel films and comics, but I didn't want Atreus, a certified good lad, to become anything other than a good lad. With that said, while Marvel does draw from the original Norse mythology, all in all, that version of Loki is an entirely different and separate character. So I read Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology to gain more context on what Atreus' transformation into Loki might actually mean, which, by the way, if you have any interest in the Norse pantheon, I would highly recommend this book because the stories are fascinating and Neil Gaiman's writing is impeccable. And amazingly, it made me feel even worse about Atreus' future. In the myths, Loki constantly tested his tenuous relationship with the other gods and eventually pushed things too far. Ragnarok. So they tracked Loki down, captured him, and turned one of his sons into a feral wolf who then ripped his other son to shreds. The gods then proceeded to tie Loki to a stone with his son's entrails, which became unbreakable bonds. And if that weren't enough, they hung a venomous snake that dripped acid on his face, all but forcing his wife to stand over him with a bowl, so that the only time he'd get acid on him was when she needed to empty it. This is said to go on until Ragnarok happens, which foretells Loki escaping his bonds and leading an army of the dead, giants, and his other children, the giant wolf Fenrir, the world serpent, and Hel, the ruler of the dead, in an invasion against Asgard, causing the death of almost all the gods and bringing about the destruction of the world by a great flood. I imagine if you played the other God of War games, this is starting to sound familiar. From the gods being responsible for the death of his family, to seeking revenge for that, to storming their holy realm with giants in tow, to the world ending with a great flood. Loki's story parallels Kratos' from the original trilogy. Now, obviously, God of War takes a ton of liberties with its source material, and based on things that have already happened in the game, as well as the ways the creative team has changed events and characters from the Norse myths, Atreus' path will be drastically different from the Loki of legend, and what I've laid out here could have nothing to do with God of War's future. With that said, the fact that the developers chose the god in the Norse pantheon who reflects the tale of Kratos' to be his son seems to be too big of a connection to just be a coincidence. I don't know the intentions of the developers, but I would have to imagine that when they decided for Atreus to be Loki, they considered the reaction people would have to the name itself. They considered how players would look at Atreus in an entirely new way despite him not really doing anything to warrant it. They considered how people would associate him with other versions of Loki, and because of that, many players would assume that the kind-hearted kid was destined to fall from grace. So when Kratos says, "Who I was is not who you will be," I find it hard to believe, because in the Norse myth, Loki is Kratos. And while Atreus might not have kids to avenge, he does have a father, one who we can only assume will die, starting the whole cycle anew. The more I think about God of War's ending and delve into the implications and possibilities, the more I feel like Atreus' story is an incredible reflection of growing up. No matter how much promise you show, no matter how much a parent may try to protect you from making the mistakes they made, no matter how hard you try to stick to your childhood dreams, you will have failures. You will struggle in ways your parents hoped you wouldn't, and you will not become the exact reflection of your 10-year-old self's ideal adult. And that's usually a good thing. Inner struggle is part of growing up, it's part of being a human. There is a very real possibility that Atreus will be nothing like the Loki from Norse mythology. Kratos may succeed in stopping his son from repeating his own mistakes, but regardless, adding the revelation at the end of this game sowed doubt into my mind about who Atreus would become. Throughout the story, I found myself thinking about the thousands of possibilities his future may hold. After it, I could really only see one path. A path I imagine most would not want for him. My point in all of this is that growing up will always be met with some level of disappointment. It's bittersweet, and a large part of that is because the path we end up taking in life is just one of seemingly infinite possibilities that are in front of us when we're 10 years old. When I went off to college, I was terrified of growing up. I felt like even deciding on my major would cut away hundreds of other potential futures that I once dreamed about. I feared that I would let someone down because of my choices, that I would let myself down because of them, and that anxiety, that was a major part of my story. Luckily for me, my path just led to majoring in English, not potentially causing the end of the world. We'll see though. Maybe I'm just seeing what I need to see in God of War, seeing what makes me feel like my experience was a universal one. And I'd argue that that's the true value of a complex narrative. Finding a scrap that you can hold on to and calling it your own. As a kid, coming-of-age stories gave me guidance. As an adult, they give me context. So whether it be reading Catcher in the Rye and seeing so much of an old friend in Holden Caulfield that hurts, or watching Stand By Me and recalling how those idyllic childhood days were rougher around the edges than I sometimes give them credit for being, or playing God of War, and remembering that at some point in life, everyone will become someone they don't completely recognize, these types of stories still have power, and remind us that we're not alone.